The thing about the mess hall on Outpost Vazhric 6 was the smell. Every species in the coalition ran a separate cook line, which was the polite solution to the problem of no two physiologies agreeing on what constituted food versus what constituted a biological weapon. The Pithrani had their sulfur bloom broths, which smelled like a tire fire inside a mine shaft. The Kuvali ate something that looked and moved like wet clay, and the fermentation process it required produced a low-grade ammonia that clung to every hard surface in the building for 6 hours after a meal cycle. The Vazhric line ran hot plates all day, and whatever they were cooking on them, I was never entirely sure it had been alive in any sense I recognized, produced a dense, meaty smoke that settled into the rafters and stayed there. The human line smelled like nothing in particular. Pressed ration blocks, reconstituted grain protein paste from a tube, nutritionally complete, not interesting. I had been assigned to Outpost Vazhric 6 for 31 days when this story begins, and in 31 days I had established a meal pattern as regular as anything I had done in my 7 years of service. I ate at a table in the far left corner, back to the wall, because that was where I had eaten since the second day after my arrival, and because changing habits for no reason is how you end up disoriented in environments that are already trying to disorient you. The far left corner had 2 additional advantages: sightline to the main entrance, and a position that did not place me inside the natural traffic flow of any of the species clusters that had formed in the hall over the months before I arrived. The Pithrani ate in the near right. The Kuvali had a ring of tables in the center. The Vrakthi were center right, which put them in the highest density position in the room, which they occupied because they had been on Vazhric 6 the longest of the joint forces complement and had claimed the ground accordingly. The humans, there were 6 of us total on the outpost, split across 2 units, had the left side, which was what remained. I had 1 table to myself, because the other 5 humans ate on a different cycle. I had a tray. On it, 1 ration block, the kind with the orange wrapper that meant it was the mixed grain variety, which I preferred over the gray wrapper because the gray ones tasted like chalk. A serving of reconstituted vegetable mash that was somewhere between green and gray depending on the light, a squeeze of protein paste on the side, and a cup of the coalition's universal hot drink dispensed from the machine at the end of the line, which tasted like weak tea filtered through the memory of coffee, and was the only hot beverage available to a human metabolism without special requisition. I had my fork in my hand. I was reading. The tablet was propped against the edge of my tray, tilted at a slight angle to account for the table's uneven surface. The far left corner had been installed slightly off-level, a symptom of the fast construction that had gone into the outpost's expansion 6 months earlier when the coalition had decided to increase the joint forces complement. I had shimmed the table with a folded piece of plastic I'd torn from a supply manifest 3 weeks in, and since then the tablet sat fine. I was reading a maintenance manual for the Type 7 environmental hazard suit, because 2 weeks from now my unit had a rotation to a toxic atmosphere survey on a Class 19 world, my own classification, as it happened, which I thought was a detail worth noting, and I liked to know the manual before I needed it rather than while I needed it. The Type 7 was a well-designed suit. The manual ran to 412 pages, which is a length that tells you more about the engineer's conscientiousness than it does about actual complexity. I had been through 267 pages of it over the previous 3 days. I was on the section addressing secondary seal failure in the left arm assembly. That was the situation when Das Garthek walked in. I want to be precise about this because it matters for what comes later. I noticed him when he walked through the door because I notice everyone who walks through a door I'm facing. That is not unusual for someone from where I come from. It is, in fact, the minimum. He was Vrakthi, the reptilian kind, the ones with the heavy dorsal crest that flushes a deeper green when they're agitated, and the four-fingered hands built for grip rather than dexterity, and the secondary eyelid that closes laterally when they're assessing something. He was large by Vazhric standards, which meant he was large by most standards. He stood about 2 meters at the shoulder ridge, moved with the kind of deliberate unhurry that species with a top-end metabolism use when they want to signal that they're not rushed because they don't need to be. He had a rank sash across his chest that indicated he was a ground unit enforcer. Not an officer exactly, but the kind of senior NCO who ran discipline and physical assessment in a Vazhric combat squad. His scales were the mottled dark green and amber that indicated a mature male in peak conditioning. His secondary eyelid was, at the moment he walked in, half closed. He was assessing. I went back to my manual. I heard him go through the Vazhric cook line. I heard the tray. I heard the sound of a large quadruped-descended biped moving between tables. Vazhric have a slight lateral sway at the hip that produces a rhythmically distinctive footfall, and I could track by the sound alone that he was not going to the Vazhric table cluster, which was in the center right of the hall, but was instead moving to the left side, which was where the human tables were, which was where I was. I did not look up. He stopped at my table. I could tell by the displacement of sound, and by the way the air pressure in my immediate vicinity shifted very slightly. Vazhric run hot, physiologically, and a large one standing close produces a detectable thermal signature if you're paying attention, which I was. I finished the sentence I was reading. It was about secondary seal failure in the left arm assembly of the Type 7, and the manuals suggested field fix, which involved a specific tool and a specific sequence, and I wanted to finish reading it before I looked up. Then I looked up. Das Garthek was standing at the end of my table, tray in hand, looking down at me with his secondary eyelid closed all the way, the full lateral close, which in Vazhric body language indicates either amused contempt or the specific kind of focused appraisal you perform on something you've already decided is not a threat. I had read the Vazhric field manual on non-verbal behavioral indicators. It had been included in the Joint Forces orientation packet, which I had also read. He said, in the coalition's trade language, the flat, functional pigeon that everyone on a Joint Forces base was required to maintain operational fluency in. You are the human soldier assigned to Hazard Survey Team 4. It wasn't a question. He'd clearly already confirmed this through whatever information channel he had access to, which probably meant he'd been looking at the Joint Forces roster, which was accessible to all senior NCOs. Yes, I said. He looked at my tray, then he looked at me. You are very small, he said, for a Deathworld creature. I said, yes. I picked up my fork and took a bite of the vegetable mash. He set his tray down at the far end of my table, not across from me, not beside me, but at the far end, angled so that he was facing me, his back to the rest of the hall. This was a specific positional choice. He was not sitting with me. He was positioning himself as an observer and an obstacle. The table was long enough that his tray was perhaps 2 meters from mine, which meant there was no question of proximity or crowding, but also no ambiguity about intention. He was here because he had decided to be here, and he was watching me. I went back to my manual. The file on your world, he said, lists it as a Class 19 designation under the Coalition's Planetary Hazard Index. I turned a page. Class 19, he said again, high gravity, high radiation, atmospheric toxin load, apex predator density above the survivability threshold for most enrolled species. He paused. I have seen the Class 19 file. It does not explain you. I looked up. What doesn't it explain? He gestured at me with one four-fingered hand, a broad, slow gesture that encompassed my entire physical presence at the table. The size, the softness. Vazhric who survive Class 7 conditions are not soft. They are, he searched for the trade language word, armored, conditioned. You look like something that lives in a controlled environment. I thought about this for a moment, taking another bite of the vegetable mash. "The file probably also tells you," I said, "that my world's apex predators don't survive by being the biggest or the most armored." His dorsal crest shifted, not a flush, just a small elevation. "What do they survive by?" "Efficiency," I said, "and by being patient." I picked up my tablet. He ate. I read. He left after perhaps 20 minutes without speaking again. When he was gone, I finished the section on secondary seal failure, moved on to the section on helmet atmospheric sensors, and then my meal cycle was over and I bussed my tray and went back to the barracks. I noted his name in my log. I keep a log of everyone I interact with in a joint forces environment and the interactions and what I could infer, and I wrote 2 things next to Das Garthek's entry: assessing, not hostile yet. Then I went back to the manual. That was the first day. The second day he came back. Same corner, same table, same time in the meal cycle. I was eating the gray ration block this time. I had run out of the orange ones and had not yet submitted a requisition, and I was reading a survey report on the toxic atmosphere conditions in the region we were scheduled to operate in, cross-referenced with the Type 7's operational ceiling, calculating whether there were zones the suit would handle at spec or whether we would need supplemental filtration for certain approach corridors. There were 2 corridors I had questions about. I had flagged them in the margin of the document with notes and was working through the atmospheric data tables in the appendix. He had someone with him this time. Another Vrazhric, younger, the scales still light in their patterning, the particular unsettled coloring of a soldier who has reached adult size but not yet reached the 10 years of conditioning that produces the settled scale pattern of a mature Vrazhric combatant. The dorsal crest was not yet at full adult size. A subordinate. They came through the Vrazhric cook line together and then walked to my corner. And this time they sat not at my table but at the table directly adjacent, facing me. The younger one had clearly been briefed. He was doing the full lateral eyelid assessment from the moment he sat down, which meant Das Garthek had described me to him, and the younger one was now performing his own evaluation. I could feel it without looking. I kept reading. After a few minutes, Das Garthek said, across the space between our tables, "My subordinate does not believe the Class 19 file either." "That's fine," I said. "He says a species that soft would have been eaten by the predators before it developed space travel." I turned a page. "We were the predators," I said. "We ate everything else first." There was a pause. The younger Vrazhric said something in the Vrazhric language, which I did not speak fluently, but had a limited passive familiarity with from the field manual's glossary section. What he said was something close to, "It's very sure of itself for something that size." I understood this because I had read the glossary section twice, and because tone carries across species boundaries more reliably than people tend to think. I did not indicate that I had understood it. I kept reading. Das Garthek responded in the Vrazhric language, something that translated approximately as, "That is what I told you. Watch what it does." I took a bite of the gray ration block. It tasted like chalk. I ate it anyway because the caloric load was identical to the orange one, and the flavor difference was not worth altering my established meal pattern. "The hazard survey rotation," Das Garthek said, back in trade language. 2 weeks from now, your team will be operating in the same survey grid as my unit's forward element." "I know," I said. "The atmospheric conditions in the northern approach corridor exceed the Type 7's standard operational ceiling by a margin of approximately 14%. I looked up then because this was actually relevant information, and I wanted to see whether he was testing me or genuinely informing me. His secondary eyelid was half closed. Neutral. This was the face he wore when he was not yet decided about something. "I know that too," I said. "I've been reading the survey report." He watched me. "You calculated the supplemental filtration requirement." Yes. Most humans assigned to hazard rotations do not calculate this before the pre-mission brief, he said. They wait to be told. I prefer to know before I'm told, I said. His dorsal crest elevated slightly again, same as the day before. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't contempt. I filed it and went back to my reading. They finished their meal and left. The younger one glanced back at me as they went. I let him. The third day, there were 4 of them. Das Garthek again, the younger subordinate from the second day, and 2 others I had not seen before. One with the heavy musculature of a Vazhric who had done sustained ground combat conditioning over many years, the kind of bulk that comes from load-bearing work, and not simply from size, and one who was older, the scales at the jaw ridge on the slightly lighter shade that indicates age in a male Vazhric, the kind of senior soldier who has probably survived enough to have opinions about everything, and share them freely regardless of whether he has been asked. They took the adjacent table again. I was eating the orange ration block. I had requisitioned more and a cup of the weak tea coffee drink, and I was reading a document on Joint Forces Communication Protocol, because the hazard survey would involve coordinating with Vazhric forward elements on the same radio net, and I wanted to understand their brevity codes before the pre-mission brief, not during it. The small human again, the older one said in trade language, not to me, to the table, but at conversational volume clearly intended to carry. I turned a page. It reads when it eats, the heavily muscled one said. It does other things when it eats too, Das Garthek said. It calculates filtration loads, it plans ahead. That's a survival behavior, the older one said, not strength. Planning ahead does not save you from a Vazhric grip. A Vazhric grip does not care about your reading material. I kept reading. How much do you weigh? The heavily muscled one asked me directly. I looked up. Why? I'm calculating something. I told him. He relayed the number to the others in the Vazhric language. There was a brief exchange. The older one said something that included the word for asterisk insufficient, and the younger subordinate said something that included the word for soft asterisk, which I recognized from the glossary. The heavily muscled one made a sound that, in Vazhric, carries connotations roughly equivalent to a dismissive snort. I went back to my reading. Das Garthek said to me, Vazhric of your reported body mass are classified as juvenile non-combatant, below the minimum threshold for the enforcer track. I'm not Vazhric, I said. The minimum threshold for the hazard survey team, he said, recommends members capable of sustained load-bearing in excess of 150 kilograms across broken terrain for 6-hour intervals. The recommendation is published in the Joint Forces Field Readiness Guide. I've read that guide, I said. It recommends. I met it, I said. My unit would not have been certified otherwise. You can check the certification records. A pause, then. I checked them before I came here today. I looked up. Then you know I met the threshold. I know the certification says you met it, he said. Certifications can be generous. I looked at him for a moment. His secondary eyelid was all the way open, both of them, which was the Vazhric equivalent of direct eye contact maintained as a challenge. I had read about this. I had also read about the correct response, which is to meet it without flinching and without escalating. They weren't generous, I said. They were accurate. I took a bite of my ration block and held his gaze while I chewed. He watched me eat. His secondary eyelid stayed open. I did not look away, because looking away under a maintained challenge gaze is, in Vazhric social mechanics, a form of concession, and I had no concession to make. After a few seconds, his secondary eyelid dropped to half-closed. He looked away and went back to his meal. The older one made a sound I didn't have in my glossary, not the dismissive snort, something with more texture to it. The younger subordinate was very still. I finished the section on brevity codes, and moved on to radio frequency allocation. After the third day, I updated my log. Next to Das Garthek's entry, I added, escalating systematically, bringing witnesses, testing for a reaction that isn't coming. Then I requisitioned another orange ration block because I was low again and went to sleep. The fourth day. He came alone. I noticed this immediately when he walked in, because for 3 days he had arrived with at least one other Vrakthai, and the pattern break was information worth noting. A single assessor is either a subordinate doing a solo check or a principal who no longer needs the audience. Given what I knew about him, I assumed the latter. I filed it and kept eating. I was on the Joint Forces Emergency Extraction Protocol today, the procedures for recovering personnel from a toxic atmosphere zone in the event of suit failure. This was near the end of my pre-rotation reading list. 3 days from now the tempo would pick up. I wanted the reading done before then. He went through the cook line and came to my table, and this time he did not take the adjacent seat. He put his tray down across from mine, at my table, directly opposite, and sat. I kept reading. I finished the paragraph I was on, which described the extraction corridor geometry for a 2-person team in a toxic zone with a failed primary filtration unit. Then I looked up. He was watching me with both eyelids fully open. Not a challenge this time. Something else. Assessment in the pure sense, the kind a good soldier does when they're trying to understand what they're looking at without the performance of intimidation getting in the way. He said, "The others think you are harmless." "What do you think?" I said. "I think the file is accurate," he said. "I think the Coalition's classification index does not list Class 19 worlds by mistake. I think the certification records are correct." He paused. "I think you are the most dangerous thing in this building, and you are eating a gray paste and reading a manual, and I cannot decide if that is because you are disciplined or because you genuinely do not notice that you are the most dangerous thing in this building." I looked at him. "Both," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My unit has a physical assessment exercise scheduled for this afternoon, after the meal cycle. The mess hall is adjacent to the training annex. The enforcer track runs grip strength and carry load assessments quarterly." He paused. "My subordinates think you should join. They want to see the numbers for themselves. They will not believe the certification records until they do." "And you," I said, "do you need to see the numbers?" "I told you what I think," he said, "but the others have not had 3 days of watching you read." He looked at my tablet. "I thought it would be more efficient to let them see it once rather than spending another 3 days on a conclusion they are going to reach anyway." This was, in its way, the most honest thing he had said to me in 4 days. He was not staging a demonstration for my benefit. He was managing the update process in his unit, which is a real problem that real senior NCOs deal with regularly, and he had identified the most efficient solution to it. "What time?" I said. 14th hour, he said. "I'll be there," I said, and went back to my reading. The training annex was a wide, low-ceilinged room that smelled of Vrakthi exertion, which is a sharp, mineral smell, iron, and something organic underneath. Not unpleasant, but immediately distinctive. The grip strength apparatus was a set of hydraulic resistance columns, calibrated for the Vrakthi musculoskeletal profile, which meant the resistance increments ran in intervals designed for a hand 4 times the size of mine. The carry load station was a weighted frame with a standard Coalition back-mount harness that had been adjusted, not by much, to fit a human torso. There were 9 Vrakthi in the room when I arrived at the 14th hour. Das Garthek was there, and his young subordinate from the first additional day, and the heavily muscled one from the 3rd day, and the older one, and 5 others I hadn't seen before. Some of them had clearly come specifically for this. The room had the quality of an audience that is pretending not to be an audience. They were all watching the door when I came in. I was wearing my standard off-duty fatigues, plain gray Coalition Joint Forces issue, and my unit boots. I had left my tablet in the barracks. The heavily muscled one said something in Vazhric. The older one responded. The younger subordinate looked at Das Garthek. Das Garthek said, in trade language, "The grip assessment is calibrated for the standard Vazhric range. The apparatus will need manual recalibration for a human hand." "Show me the calibration panel," I said. He showed me. I recalibrated it. It took about 4 minutes, which I spent in silence, working through the calibration menu on the apparatus interface while 9 Vazhric watched. The silence had a particular quality. They were watching my hands, I think, the size of them, the way I worked through the menu, the absence of hesitation. When I was done, I ran a test squeeze with my left hand to confirm the sensor was reading correctly, checked the output against the human physiological reference range that I had memorized from the Joint Forces Field Readiness Guide, and then stood up and did the formal assessment. I will not give you the numbers because the numbers are not the point. What I will tell you is that they fell within normal range for a human of my size and conditioning. Which was the top of that range, because I was in good condition, and because I had been in training for 7 years, and because where I come from conditioning is not a program you run for a deployment cycle. It is a posture you maintain indefinitely, because the alternative is being less capable than the environment requires, and the environment on a Class 19 world does not accept excuses. The grip assessment measures what it measures. I had spent enough time developing mine that the numbers were what they were. When the reading came up, the room was quiet for a moment. The older one said something in Vazhric. I caught 2 words from my glossary. Inadequate was not one of them. Different was. The phrase following it was something I didn't have a clean translation for, a compound construction that seemed to combine the concept of unexpected configuration with something like functional effectiveness. The emotional register, skeptical surprise working its way toward revision, was readable without a dictionary. "Carry load next," Das Garthek said. The weighted frame was set to the standard coalition carry load assessment figure. I had done this test in my unit's quarterly reviews, enough times that the process was automatic. I put the frame on, adjusted the harness fit, checked the buckles in the standard order, shoulder, hip, sternum, and walked the prescribed course. The length of the training annex, across a set of terrain obstacles including 2 platform climbs and a low-clearance crawl section, and back. I did not run it. I walked it at a pace sustainable for the 6-hour interval cited in the Joint Forces Field Readiness Guide, because a sprint produces an impressive number in an assessment and a useless number in the field, and I was interested in accurate numbers. I set the frame down at the carry load station and stood. The heavily muscled one had his arms crossed. He was looking at me differently than he had in the mess hall. Not warmly. Vazhric do not do warmth in the sense I mean it. They have a different set of registers for positive regard, but with the secondary eyelid at a particular midpoint that I now had enough data to interpret as something between respect and recalibration. His internal model had been adjusted. He said something to Das Garthek. Das Garthek responded in Vazhric. The younger subordinate was quiet and very still. The older one made a sound, the one I hadn't had in my glossary on day 3, but now, with the context of the room and the moment and 3 days of accumulated data on Vazhric behavioral registers, I thought I was starting to understand it. It was the sound for *HM. So that's what that is. Revision completed. New model accepted. "One more assessment," Das Garthek said. "What is it?" I said. He gestured to the sparring floor at the back of the training annex. A large, flat surface marked with the standard coalition sparring grid, colored boundary lines, center point marker. The kind of floor I had trained on dozens of times on a dozen different installations. "Reaction and close quarters assessment," he said. "Joint Forces standard protocol. No contact above the shoulders, no joint locks to submission, no throws to submission. Scoring by boundary exits." I looked at the floor. Against who? He looked at the young subordinate. The young one straightened immediately and walked to the sparring floor without being asked twice. He took a position at one end of the center point grid and settled into his weight, which in Vazhric's sparring stance is a low, stable squat with the center of gravity dropped and the arms loose at the sides. He moved with the quick, self-assured energy of a Vazhric who had been assessed and found adequate and knew it. He was good. I could see that from where I was standing. I walked to the center of the floor and stood, not in a stance, just standing. The older one made a small sound, not the revision sound, something with a question in it. "Ready," I said. Vazhric made the start signal. What happened next took perhaps 45 seconds in total, spread across 3 separate exchanges. I will describe it plainly because the plain description is more useful than a dramatic one. The young subordinate came at me at the speed, an angle that a Vazhric at his conditioning uses when they are confident and not yet recalibrated. It is a committed advance, momentum forward, relying on the mass differential to carry it through. I was not where he expected me to be when he arrived. I had moved a step and a half off his line, which is not as impressive as it sounds. I had read the Vazhric close quarters movement patterns in the field manual, and the initial advance angle is predictable within a small range from the stance position, and I had been watching his stance for 30 seconds before the signal. He adjusted. He was good. He had real training. The adjustment was quick. I was not where he expected me to be then either. The second time I was on the outside of his momentum line, which in a biped committed to a forward advance, Vazhric or otherwise, is a position from which a boundary exit can be produced without requiring a strength exchange. First exit. He reset and came again. This time he adjusted his initial angle to account for where I had been. He was learning in real time, which is the sign of a good sparring partner. I was already somewhere else. Second exit. Slower than the first. I let it be slower, because I wanted to see the specific adjustment he made before giving away the third. The third exit came from a direction he had not planned for, because I moved toward him instead of away. Inside the grip range of a species optimized for grasping is a specific zone where the grip mechanics cannot engage at full efficiency. You are inside the arc of the arms, and the angles are wrong, and the leverage options that exist there favor someone who understands them and has practiced in that space. I had practiced in that space for 7 years. What happened in the third exchange was not a dramatic display. It was geometry and timing, applied in a space where a Vazhric grip was not a threat because I was not where a Vazhric grip could close. Third exit. 45 seconds. The room had the quality of a room that was very quiet. Not startled quiet. Vazhric soldiers are not startled by sparring results. They have seen enough sparring. This was the quiet of 9 individuals updating something simultaneously. The older one's secondary eyelid was at the revision position. The heavily muscled one's arms were uncrossed and at his sides. The young subordinate was standing on the floor, not having reset, looking at me with both eyelids fully open, the direct gaze register, but not challenge. I recognized what it was after a moment. It was the look you give something when you are trying to understand what you just saw, working it back through the sequence, trying to find where the geometry changed. Assessment complete, Vazhric said. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the older one said the revision sound him. So that's what that is, and added 3 words in Vazhric. I processed them against my glossary. The first word was asterisk small asterisk. The second word was asterisk clean asterisk. The third word was a compound I did not have a direct gloss for. It combined the concept of correct function with something like inevitability, the quality of a mechanism that produces its result, because that is what it is and what it does, and the outcome was never really in question once it started. I understood the gist. I picked up my jacket from where I had set it by the wall, said good session to the room in trade language, and went back to the barracks. I updated my log. Next to Vazhric's entry I wrote, assessment completed, conclusion, satisfied. Then I went back to the emergency extraction protocol. The 5th day. I want to be careful here because this is the part that matters, and the sequence needs to be exact. I was 3 days out from the hazard survey. The morning had been taken up with a unit brief on approach corridor assignments and a final equipment check. I had already flagged and submitted the supplemental filtration requisition for the northern corridor, which had been approved after a logistics exchange that took 2 days, and the Type 3 supplemental packs were confirmed in the pre-rotation manifest. My reading list was nearly complete. The afternoon meal cycle was the last calm window before the pre-rotation tempo changed. I was reading a cartography document at my usual table, topographical data for the survey grid, annotated with the forward element positions including Das Garthex unit's zone. I had been integrating the radio brevity codes with the terrain map so that I would have a coherent spatial picture of the operating area before I set foot in it. Das Garthek came in at the usual time, alone, went through the Vazhric cook line, came to my table and sat directly across from me, same as the day before the training annex. His secondary eyelid was at the midpoint, not challenge, not the revision position. The face he wore when he was thinking something through and working out whether to say it. He sat for perhaps 2 minutes without speaking. I turned 2 pages. Then he said, "There is a problem." I looked up. He put his tray to the side, a specific gesture, clearing the table between us, and leaned forward slightly. Not aggression. The posture of someone communicating urgency without performing it. "The northern approach corridor," he said, "the atmospheric conditions, the 14% overage on the Type 7 ceiling, the supplemental filtration units approved for your team." He paused, choosing his trade language words carefully. "The units approved are the standard Type 3 supplemental pack. They will cover the 14% overage in the primary corridor. They will not cover the auxiliary access route." I kept my expression neutral. Why not? "The auxiliary access route runs through a secondary venting zone," he said. "The toxin load in that zone is not 14% over ceiling. It is 63% over ceiling. A Type 3 pack will not handle it. The functional window in a 63% overage environment is approximately 22 minutes. Your mission profile in the secondary zone runs 40 minutes minimum." I looked at him. "How do you know this?" "My forward element ran a preliminary survey pass on the full grid last rotation cycle," he said. "The data was submitted to Coalition Command. It is in the updated survey files." He paused. "The update was filed under a different document identification number than the original survey report. It is cross-referenced to the original only by survey grid coordinate. Your logistics team would have pulled from the original report by document number. They would not have seen the update unless they searched by grid coordinate specifically." I picked up my tablet. "What is the document reference?" I said. He told me. I pulled up the Coalition shared document registry and ran the search by grid coordinate. The file was there, exactly as he described, different document number, same grid, the cross-reference buried in the metadata rather than the document chain. Filed 11 days ago. Our logistics pull had been 13 days ago. I read the update. The auxiliary access route ran through a collapsed subsurface venting structure that had not been mapped in the original survey. The toxin load in the secondary zone was not 14% above the Type 7 ceiling. It was 63% above it. A Type 3 supplemental pack had an effective window in a 63% overage condition of 22 minutes. A Type 5 supplemental pack, the next grade up, designed for high-toxin industrial environments, could handle the full mission profile at that overage level. I looked up. "Your unit will be using Type 5 packs in the secondary zone." "Yes, we have been using them for grid operations since the preliminary survey." "You came here to tell me this." He looked at me with his secondary eyelid at the midpoint again. "Your team would have entered the auxiliary access route with inadequate filtration," he said. The mission profile requires coverage of the full survey grid, including the secondary zone. You would not have known the pack was undersized until the exposure symptoms began. At that point, you would have been 700 meters inside a venting zone, with no adequate extraction route on a Class 19 equivalent toxin load. He paused. The outcome of that is not a calculation I needed to run twice. I thought about this. I thought about the original survey report, which I had read and which said nothing about the auxiliary access route. I thought about the logistics chain and the document numbering system and the 11-day gap and the way critical information gets siloed in a joint forces environment where every unit is pulling from the same database via different access conventions. I thought about the fact that none of that was Das Garthek's fault or mine. And I thought about the fact that the man sitting across from me had noticed the gap, had confirmed it, and had come to the mess hall to tell me. "Thank you," I said. I sent an urgent requisition flag to my logistics coordinator with the updated document reference and the Type 5 pack requirement, drafted a note to my unit lead about the correction. And then, because my tray was still in front of me and the meal cycle was not yet over, picked up my fork and went back to my vegetable mash. We ate in silence for a while. It was a different kind of silence than any of the ones before. The first silences had been loaded with watching. This one was two soldiers eating, which is one of the more straightforward things in the world. After perhaps 10 minutes, he said, "You did not ask me why I came here." "You told me why," I said. "Mission safety." "Yes," he said, "and because," he paused, selecting his words, "the first day I came here I had already decided that you were the weakest element in the joint forces complement, not hostile, not a threat, a liability." His secondary eyelid moved to the full open position, not challenge, but the direct gaze register I now understood as a particular form of candor. I was wrong. I have been in military service for 19 years. When I make an error about personnel, I correct it. I ate a bite of the gray protein paste. "What changed your assessment?" "The reading," he said, "and the calm." He picked up his utensil. "When I walked in on the first day, you were reading a maintenance manual, not because someone had assigned it, because you were 3 weeks from a toxic atmosphere rotation and you wanted to know the equipment before you needed it. Every other human in the joint forces rotation was, at the same time, in the common area or exercising or sleeping. You were the only one reading a manual." He set the utensil down. "I have deployed with humans twice before. The ones I did not need to worry about were always the ones who did the reading." I thought about this. "You spent 4 days testing me." "Yes." "And then on the 5th day, you came to tell me something that could prevent my team from dying in a secondary venting zone." "Yes." "You could have come to tell me on the first day," I said. He looked at me steadily. His secondary eyelid closed slowly to the half point. "I could have," he said, "but then I would not have confirmed my assessment." I ate the last of the vegetable mash and sat with that for a moment. It was sound operational logic. He needed to know what I was before he was willing to trust me with information that affected the mission and that affected his unit's exposed flank. The testing was not pointless. It was methodology, applied systematically, with a conclusion built from accumulated observation rather than a single data point. It was, in fact, the same thing I would have done. "That's fair," I said. We finished our meal. The requisition for the Type 5 supplemental packs hit a snag that afternoon. The outpost's Type 5 pack inventory was allocated. Most of the stock had been committed to a separate rotation team, and the remainder was below the number my team required. The shortfall was 3 units. My logistics coordinator flagged it back with a note that resourcing from the nearest resupply depot would take 48 hours minimum, inside our deployment window. We would deploy with a 3-unit shortfall in critical filtration equipment, or we would push the rotation date. Pushing the rotation date required coalition command approval and would affect the joint forces survey schedule and Das Garthek's forward element positioning. because our survey grid coverage unlocked the zone authorization for their advance into the secondary operational area. It was not a clean option. I sent the problem to my unit lead. My unit lead sent it up the logistics chain. The chain flagged it as a potential rotation delay and began the approval process. 40 minutes later, a message came through the Joint Forces Coordination Channel from the Vazhric unit. Vazhric's unit carries a standard Vazhric field loadout, which includes atmospheric protection gear calibrated for their physiology. Their atmospheric packs run on a different filtration architecture than the Coalition's Type series. They are Vazhric standard, built for a species that evolved on a world with a naturally elevated atmospheric toxin baseline, which means their baseline protection grade runs above the Coalition's Type 5 equivalent on the Cross-Species Compatibility Index. The Coalition Field Compatibility Index lists a Vazhric standard atmospheric pack at their standard issue grade as equivalent to approximately a Type 5 for human physiology. The message offered to loan 3 surplus Vazhric standard atmospheric packs from the unit reserve to cover the human team's shortfall. It included a note from Vazhric himself, 2 sentences. The first explained the compatibility calculation with the reference index citation. The second said, "The human soldier on this team does not create risk for her unit. Resource the mission correctly." My unit lead approved the loan. The rotation went ahead as scheduled. The hazard survey itself went without incident. In the military sense, all objectives met, all personnel returned, no red line items in the debrief. The Northern Corridor required the Type 5 equivalent packs in the auxiliary access route exactly as the updated survey report had indicated. The Vazhric standard loaner packs worked correctly under human physiology, which I had confirmed against the compatibility index before deployment and not been surprised by. The 22-minute window that a Type 3 pack would have given us in the secondary zone was not a constraint we encountered. We were in the secondary zone for 41 minutes. We covered the full survey grid, pulled the samples we needed, documented the venting structure, and came out. The return transit put my unit and Vazhric's forward element on the same Coalition Type 4 extraction transport, which is large enough for mixed species complements and runs separated atmosphere zones divided by a bulkhead with a viewport panel. I was in the human zone and the Vazhric were in theirs, and at some point during the transit I looked through the viewport. He was on the other side, sitting in the Vazhric zone, reading something on a data slate. His secondary eyelid was closed all the way, not challenge, not assessment. The way it closes when a soldier is done with the operational posture and processing down. Relaxed. The expression of a mission that had closed without gap. He didn't look up. I watched him read for a moment. Then I went back to my side and ate the last orange ration block I had in my pack, because it was a long transit and I was hungry, and I had not submitted a special requisition for any alternative and saw no reason to. I am telling you this story from 3 years after the Vazhric 6 rotation. I am telling it because someone asked me once how I had learned to operate in mixed species environments without it being difficult. I had been eating lunch at the time, reconstituted vegetable mash, which is always somewhere between green and gray, in a mess hall at a different outpost, and the person who asked was a young human soldier, new to the Joint Forces program, sitting across from me with the carefully maintained neutral expression of someone who has been briefed that everything is fine and is working hard to act accordingly. I told her I would think about the best answer. This is the answer. The first thing is that Vazhric was not an antagonist in any sense that matters. He was a senior soldier in a different military tradition conducting a systematic assessment of an unknown quantity placed adjacent to his operational area. What he did, the 4 days of observation, the physical assessment exercise, the testing, was exactly what I would have done had our positions been reversed. He needed to know whether I was a liability before he shared information that affected his unit's mission. He found out I wasn't. He shared the information. Then he resourced the mission correctly. That is not harassment. That is methodology. It felt like harassment sometimes, particularly on the third day with 4 of them at the adjacent table, and the older one calculating what my body mass meant for a Vazhric grip. But that feeling is not reliable information. Feelings generated by being assessed are just feelings. They do not change what the situation is, and treating them as data will cause you to make errors that are difficult to correct. The second thing is that I was not going to help him find out I was a liability by acting like one. Every time he came to the mess hall, I was doing what I should have been doing, reading the manual, running the calculations, eating my food. The calm was not performed for his benefit. The calm was just the calm, the thing you maintain because the environment requires it, and because performing calm when you are not actually calm has a tell somewhere, and a good soldier will find it. And Vazhric was a good soldier. But the calm was also the correct response to that situation in a purely functional sense, because the correct response to being assessed by someone competent is to be accurately yourself, without addition or subtraction, and let the conclusion form from accurate data. The third thing is the sparring floor, and I want to be precise about it. When the young subordinate came at me on the third exit, I moved toward him rather than away from him. Not because I had no other option, and not to prove anything. Because moving into the grip range was the right move for that specific geometry, and I knew it was the right move, and I was willing to be inside of Vazhric grip range long enough to execute it, because I had calculated that I could be, and had practiced being there enough times that the calculation was accurate. I did not explain this before I did it. I did not announce the plan. I did not ask for acknowledgement afterward. I executed it, and the outcome was the outcome. The older Vazhric said the word small, clean, inevitable, and I thought about that third word for a long time afterward. In the Vazhric language, it is a compound used for things that function correctly, machines that do what they were built to do, plans that close without gaps, soldiers confirmed to be what they were listed as. The word does not mean impressive. It does not mean surprising. It means the result was always going to be this result, given the inputs. You just didn't know the inputs yet. I don't know whether I earned it in 45 seconds on a sparring floor at Outpost Vazhric 6. I know I did not try to earn it. I tried to be accurate. If the word applied, it applied because the facts supported it. The same way the certification record was accurate and not generous. The same way the filtration calculation was correct. The same way the requisition was right and the rotation date held. That young soldier at the other outpost asked me, "What if the accurate version of yourself isn't enough?" I told her, "Then you find that out before the secondary zone and you fix the pack. That's what the reading is for." She wasn't sure what I meant. I told her she would be eventually. Then I finished my vegetable mash, reconstituted, between green and gray, exactly as it always is, and I went back to work. There is a coda I left out of the main account because it did not fit cleanly in the sequence, but it belongs here. The evening of the third day, after I had returned from the mess hall and updated my log, the heavily muscled Vazhric, his name, I learned later from the Joint Forces roster, was Devesh Onveth, Senior Ground Assault Specialist in Vazhric's unit, 11 years of active service and 3 citations for field conduct under hostile atmospheric conditions, came to the human barracks corridor. He did not come inside. He stood in the corridor and knocked on the door frame, which is the Joint Forces convention for requesting entry to another species' quarters. And when I opened the door, he was standing there in his off-duty wrap, arms at his sides, secondary eyelids at a position I had not yet catalogued. I said Devesh Onveth. He looked mildly surprised that I knew his name. I had read the roster. He said in trade language, "The carry load assessment this afternoon." He stopped. "Yes," I said. "I said your mass was insufficient," he said, Before I saw the result, he paused again, and I could see him working through the trade language vocabulary, which was not his strongest channel. That was a pre-result statement, based on a pre-result model. I know, I said. The model was incorrect, he said. I looked at him. His secondary eyelids were at the position I had not yet catalogued. I filed it now as something between formal discomfort and the specific register of a soldier who has done something that required a correction, and is making that correction directly rather than through a chain or by silence. In a human, I would have called it the look of someone who is apologizing without using the word, because in their tradition the action of appearing and saying it plainly is itself the apology, and the word would be redundant. I know that too, I said. He nodded once. The Vazhric single nod is an affirmation gesture. I had read this, and turned and walked back down the corridor. I closed the door and updated my log. Next to Drevesh Anveth's entry I wrote, corrects in person, good soldier. Then I went back to the emergency extraction protocol. I include this because it is easy, when you are being assessed and found adequate after a period of being assessed and found wanting, to feel that the original assessment was the real one, and the revision is just a face-saving exercise. In my experience, that is almost never true. The revision is real. The soldier who comes to your door in the off-duty hour and says the model was incorrect, that soldier is telling you something true about himself that is more useful to know than anything about the model. What he is telling you is that when he makes an error, he corrects it. And in a joint forces environment on a toxic atmosphere survey grid with a 63% overage in the secondary zone, a soldier who corrects his errors is a soldier you want to know about. Drevesh Anveth was the one who spotted the extraction corridor geometry error on day 2 of the hazard survey, when the topographic data in the operational package had a misaligned reference point that would have sent us down a false approach to the secondary zone. He flagged it on the Joint Forces comms net clearly and early, and the approach was corrected, and we lost 11 minutes on the timeline and nothing else. I noted it in the post-mission debrief. His unit lead, which was Das Garthek, had already noted it first. The model updates when it has new data. That is the only sensible way to operate. The soldiers who understand this, whatever species they are the ones I am glad to share a survey grid with. That young soldier across from me in the mess hall at the other outpost, the one with the carefully maintained neutral expression. I noticed she was not eating much. She had a tray in front of her, but she had been moving the contents around more than consuming them, which is a behavior I recognize. Unfamiliar environment, unfamiliar species, the cognitive load of constant alertness eating into the appetite. I said, "Eat your meal." She looked at me. "Whatever you're processing," I said, "you will process it more accurately on a full caloric load. The alertness is correct. The not eating is a mistake." I picked up my fork. "Eat the meal and stay alert. Do not sacrifice one for the other." She ate. That is also part of the answer to her question. The mixed species environment is not difficult in the abstract. It is only difficult when you manage it badly, and managing it badly means either ignoring the assessment signals from the species around you, which produces surprises, or spending so much energy on the alertness that you stop functioning well, which produces a different set of problems. The solution is to stay accurate. Read the manual. Eat the meal. Know the document registry well enough to pull the updated file. And if a soldier in a different unit's corridor tells you the model was incorrect, hear that for what it is. The vegetable mash between green and gray, the weak tea, the orange ration block, the same corner, the same shimmed table, the tablet at its angle. The work is the work, that does not change. One last thing, because I realize I never said it plainly. Das Garthek and I were assigned to the same survey grid for the full Vareth 6 rotation, which ran another 4 months after the hazard survey closed. We crossed paths in the mess hall most days. He ate. I read. Sometimes we talked about the operational picture, the grid sectors we were both covering, the atmospheric data coming in from the forward element sensors, the logistics chain that kept producing minor problems requiring minor corrections. Sometimes we did not talk at all. At some point, I stopped noting his arrivals in my log, not because I had stopped paying attention, because he had moved from the category of asterisk unknown quantity requiring assessment to the category of asterisk known factor, assessed, accurate model established. In a joint forces environment, that rotation is always a good outcome, not guaranteed, not common, but when it happens it is worth noting, which is why I am noting it here. The last day of the rotation, when my unit was staged for departure and the transport was loading, he was at the staging area on other business, a logistics coordination meeting with the outpost supply chain. He walked past the loading zone, saw me, and stopped. He said in trade language, "The Type 7 secondary seal, did the field fix work?" I had used the field fix once during the rotation, on a medium toxin survey day when the left arm assembly developed a slow leak in the second hour of a 4-hour profile. The fix had held for the remaining 2 hours, and the suit had been serviced on return. "It worked," I said. He made the revision sound him, "So that's what that is," and walked on. That was the last thing he said to me. I have thought about it more than once since, because it was an odd final note. He had watched me read that manual on the first day. He had spent 4 days testing everything that came after it. And the last question he asked was whether the thing I had been reading when he first walked in had been worth reading. The answer was yes, it usually is.